On a sweltering spring night in 1918, the city of New Orleans was rocked by a gruesome murder, one that would become the first in a string of brutal attacks that would leave the city paralyzed with fear. The victim was Joseph Maggio, a 33-year-old grocer whose life was brutally cut short by a merciless killer wielding an axe. The police were baffled, and the city was gripped by terror as the killer struck again and again, targeting Italian and Jewish immigrants, mostly grocers and shopkeepers. The victims were bludgeoned to death with an axe, their heads and faces shattered beyond recognition. The police were stumped, and the city was in a state of panic. The killer seemed to strike at random, leaving behind a trail of blood and terror. The people of New Orleans lived in fear, wondering who the next victim would be and when the killer would strike again. As the body count rose, the police scrambled to find a lead, but every door they knocked on seemed to lead to a dead end. They interviewed witnesses, scoured the streets, and analyzed evidence, but nothing seemed to point to the killer's identity. The city was gripped by fear, and the police were no closer to catching the killer. Detective Louis Schmid was tasked with leading the investigation, but he was no closer to catching the killer. The police were stumped, and the city was in a state of panic. The killer seemed to be always one step ahead, leaving behind a trail of clues that led nowhere. The police were under pressure to catch the killer, but every lead seemed to fizzle out. The city was gripped by fear, and the police were no closer to catching the killer. As the investigation dragged on, the police began to suspect that the killer was targeting specific communities, Italian and Jewish immigrants. They started to patrol the streets, looking for any sign of the killer, but he seemed to be always one step ahead. The police were no closer to catching the killer, and the city was in a state of panic. The killer sent a chilling letter to the police, claiming to be a voodoo practitioner and warning of future attacks. The letter was signed the Axeman, and it seemed to confirm the police's worst fears. The killer was taunting them, daring them to catch him, but he seemed to be always one step ahead. The police were stumped, and the city was gripped by fear. It was a clever journalist, William H. Thomas, who finally cracked the case. He had been following the story and had a hunch that the killer was not what he seemed. He started to dig deeper, looking for any lead that might point to the killer's identity. And then, he got a tip that would change everything. A witness came forward, claiming to have seen the killer in action. The witness described the killer as a tall, thin man with a scar on his cheek. The police were skeptical at first, but Thomas was convinced that this was the break they had been waiting for. He convinced the police to follow up on the lead, and it was a decision that would change the course of the investigation. The police finally had a lead, and they were determined to catch the killer. The police followed the lead and eventually tracked down a suspect, Frank Jordano. He was a 35-year-old Italian immigrant who matched the witness's description. The police brought him in for questioning, and he seemed nervous and agitated. But did he have anything to do with the murders? The police were not sure, but they were convinced that they had finally caught the killer. Frank Jordano was arrested and charged with the murders, a move that came after months of intense investigation by the New Orleans Police Department. The trial was a sensational affair, with the city hanging on every word. The prosecution presented their case, led by District Attorney John Parker, and the defense was left to try and poke holes in the evidence. But the evidence was overwhelming, and it seemed clear that Jordano was guilty. A key piece of evidence was a bloody axe handle found at the scene of one of the murders, which matched the axe handle in Jordano's possession. The prosecution also presented testimony from eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen Jordano near the scenes of the crimes. Additionally, a former accomplice of Jordano's came forward, stating that Jordano had confessed to the murders. The defense, however, argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Jordano was being framed. But the jury was not convinced, and the verdict was guilty. Jordano was sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that was met with a mix of relief and skepticism from the community. The city breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that the killer was behind bars. But the question on everyone's mind was Jordano the real killer? The police were convinced that he was, but some people still had doubts. Many pointed to a lack of motive, as Jordano was not known to have any connections to the Italian and Jewish communities that were targeted by the Axeman. Others questioned the reliability of the eyewitness testimony and the former accomplice's confession. The Axeman case was one of the most notorious in New Orleans history, and it would leave a lasting impact on the city. The police had solved the case, but some questions still lingered. Who was the real killer, and why had they targeted Italian and Jewish immigrants? The answers would remain a mystery forever, but one thing was clear: the Axeman had left his mark on the city of New Orleans.